The GoPro Hero 10 Black was released about 10 days ago. I've used the GoPro Hero 10 several hours a day for each of those 10 days. I experimented with every single configuration, almost, in order to determine what the best settings are for getting the best footage with this camera. In today's video, I'm going to show you each and every best setting that I configured on here, and I'm going to explain what the best use cases are for each setting so that you can determine if you would like to use that setting. Let's get started. Now, two things you'll want to do before you start using the GoPro. When you first take it out of the box, you'll want to make sure you update the firmware. This year, GoPro did ship these cameras with a sticker affixed to the back that tells you to update the firmware first, and it is a default, which is great. Updating the firmware is important because you'll have all the latest settings and features, as well as bug fixes from GoPro. After you've updated that, you'll want to make sure you format your micro SD card. This will help ensure your micro SD card is as compatible as possible with this new camera. First thing you're going to want to do is power on your GoPro. There are a few settings here that you're going to want to change before we get into the detailed best settings. In order to get to those, you're going to want to swipe down, and you're going to see this screen here. There are two really important ones here. The first one is this one with the grid. I recommend turning the grid on. This is going to give you your rule of thirds in the camera, where generally you want to keep somebody's eyes in that top third of the frame. That's a little tip and trick that's part of good cinematography, and it makes it much easier when you have those lines there to help you out. The other item you're going to want to select is this one right here. This is the orientation. You're going to want to lock that. So when you lock that orientation, if you tilt the camera like this, it's not going to go to portrait mode. It's going to stay landscape for you. Those three settings in blue right there are the ones that I recommend turning on. And then one more setting you're going to want to check is you're going to want to swipe right and go to preferences. Under preferences, you're going to want to select general. And you're going to want to make sure that video compression is set to HEVC. With some of the past GoPros, it was not always set to HEVC. I believe it is by default now, but you're just going to want to make sure, because if it's not set to that, you're not going to have all of the options available, because HEVC is a newer type of compression, and it will allow you to capture a lot more detail in your footage than the H.264 old standard would have. HEVC is also known as H.265. Once you've checked those few settings, we're ready to dive into all of the detailed best settings. So first thing you'll want to do is you'll want to make sure you're in the video mode. Once you're in the video mode, you're going to go down here to the bottom and click here where it says standard. So I have 4 different modes configured on here, and I'm going to go through all 4 of these, and I'm going to explain what each mode is used for, and I'm going to provide every single best setting for each mode. First mode we're going to start with is standard at the top. So the first settings we're going to configure are the resolution and the frame rate. The GoPro Hero 10 does have a brand new 5.3K resolution, which is the highest resolution a GoPro has ever offered. This standard mode is a mode that I'm going to use to shoot all of my footage, except my footage where I'm talking to the camera, or my footage where I want super slow motion. So otherwise, 5.3K 60 frames per second is the mode I'm going to go with for everything else. And the reason for that is this offers maximum flexibility. If I want the finished product to be in 60 frames per second to show a particular type of motion, it will have that. But if I would like to slow it down to 30 frames per second, which would be 50% slower, or 24 frames per second, which would be even slower than that, I have the ability to do so. This is done through a method referred to as interpretation. I can take that 5.3K 60 frames per second, and I can interpret it as 5.3K 24 frames per second. So we're going to set the mode here by selecting the resolution and then the frame rate. Now, something you'll notice here at the bottom is the 24 frames per second is grayed out and not available currently. This was an interesting choice on GoPro's part to not have that included, but GoPro does say they will include it in a November firmware update. At present, you have the 60 frames per second and the 30 frames per second available for 5.3K. For the lens, you're going to have 4 different options. Those options are going to range from wide, down to linear with horizon leveling, all the way down to narrow. For this, I am almost always going to use linear plus horizon leveling. And the reason for that is the linear mode is going to make sure there's none of the fisheye effect. It has a slight crop where the camera addresses that inside the camera. And the horizon leveling, I also want to have so that if I tilt my camera slightly, the horizon is not going to get thrown off. On the previous GoPro Hero 9, horizon leveling worked all the way to a 27-degree tilt. But on the GoPro Hero 10, you can tilt the camera all the way up to 45 degrees and it will still keep the horizon level. I find this very useful. The use cases where I would not have it in horizon leveling is if I'm biking or doing some type of fast action like that, where I actually want the horizon to bend as I go along. So if you're doing something really intense action, you probably don't want horizon leveling on. You probably want to use either linear or wide. But this is my go-to mode. Linear plus horizon leveling works in almost all cases. Next setting here is Hyper Smooth. Hyper Smooth 4.0 is really good on this camera. This is one of the things I've been most impressed with while I tested it. I thought Hyper Smooth 3.0 was about the best GoPro could get, but Hyper Smooth 4.0 is even better. I put it to the standard option here. If you put it to the boost at the top, it's going to crop it by 10% more, and I don't want to lose that extra 10% of the footage. I want to keep as much of that frame as I can. There, of course, is also the option to turn it off. There's not really a good reason to have Hyper Smooth off unless you have the GoPro attached to some type of external gimbal, in which case it may make sense to turn it off, but I recommend having that standard mode here in the middle. The next setting here, scheduled capture, I'm going to keep off. Duration, I'm gonna have that set to no limit. Hindsight, I have that off. For hindsight mode, your camera will have to be turned on. So hindsight is only useful if your camera's turned on but not recording and you miss a moment that you wish you had captured. So it could be a useful feature depending on what you're doing, but by default, I keep this set to off. We're gonna go down to the next batch of settings here. Timer, I have that set to off, and zoom, I have it set to 1. 1 is the default. I don't like to use zoom on here because it is digital zoom and the video will quickly get grainy and lose its quality. So if I want to zoom something, I will do that later on when I'm editing, because shooting in 5.3K does give you a lot of flexibility when it comes to zooming and still having the footage look good. The next batch of settings under ProTune are really important. First of all, for the bitrate, I want to make sure that's set to high. The bitrate on this camera is going to be 100 megabits per second. It's going to provide maximum detail and quality in your video. If you have it set to low, it's not going to look as good and it's not going to be as flexible for you later on when you want to edit it. So I always recommend keeping that set to high. For shutter, I'm going to always have this set to auto unless I am using ND filters. ND stands for neutral density, and the ND filter does allow you to filter the brightness of the light. If you have an ND filter, you will want to set the shutter speed to twice what your frame rate is. So in this case, we're shooting in 60 frames per second. You would want to set the shutter to 1/120th, which you do that by dragging this up here. And if you were shooting in 30 frames per second, you would want to set the shutter to 1/60th. But I am not using ND filters with this, and unless you are, I recommend keeping the shutter auto. That's going to be really important for proper stabilization of your footage without it looking odd. For EV comp, this is important to not keep this at 0. I recommend always setting it to -0.5. This is going to compensate for that exposure slightly. GoPros by default tend to overexpose a little. And if you keep it slightly underexposed, you're going to get more detail in the clouds and in other type of bright lighting situations. Your highlights and your shadows are going to also retain more of their detail. When you're editing later on, you can always bump the exposure back up a little bit, but it's important to have your camera recording as much detail as possible in your footage without it being overexposed. For white balance, There are a lot of options with this. It's gonna depend on time of day you're shooting. By default, I normally keep this at 5500K because that is a good white balance for when I'm shooting in the middle of the day. But whatever you do, do not keep that at auto if you're going to edit the footage later on. If you're not going to edit the footage, you could keep it at auto. But if you are going to edit it, keep that white balance the same, and it'll make it a lot easier for you to edit later on. Otherwise, your footage could have a different white balance, and that's going to make it really tricky to put that all on one timeline. For ISO minimum, I recommend always keeping that at 100. That's gonna help ensure you have the lowest possible ISO when in bright lighting. But at the same time, the ISO maximum, I recommend keeping that at 800. 800 is gonna help ensure your camera has proper lighting if you're in a lower light situation, or if it's during the early morning or later evening hours. I also find this to work really well when I am on hikes and I'm going in and out of the shade. Having that ISO max set to 800 on the GoPro Hero 10 does matter. If the max is set to only 400, I do find a little bit of stabilization issues when I'm in the shade. So I recommend keeping it at 800. And it's important you not go over the 800 for the max. If you get to 1600, you're going to start to see a lot of noise in your footage and it's not going to look great. For sharpness, you're gonna have low, medium, or high for your option here. I do not ever recommend setting it to high, but I do recommend setting it to either medium or low. Medium is my preferred balance here, but if you're going to do a lot of editing later on, you could set that to low and that would be fine. But I prefer medium. That medium is a happy medium. It's not too sharp and it's not too low on the sharpness. I find that the camera captures better detail when it's set to medium. Sometimes when it's set to low, even if I sharpen later on, I feel like some of that detail is missing. But definitely do not set it to high. I find that the high sharpness is too sharp and it tends to look really bad with a lot of scenes. So I prefer medium. And then when I'm editing later on, if there's scenes that need a little bit of sharpness, I'll add some. But generally I find the sharpness to be great at medium and I don't really have to change it. Color mode, there's a lot to talk about here. So with the previous generations of GoPro had two options for color mode. They had flat or they had GoPro for the color. With the GoPro Hero 10, there's a brand new option and it's called natural. I have tested out the 3 different color modes on here extensively and I really like the natural. The natural does look really good and true to its name, it does capture the color really well in a natural sense. It's not too saturated, it's not too undersaturated, and the colors seem to be accurate. However, you do still have 2 other options. The Vibrant is going to be more like the GoPro mode of the past. Vibrant is going to have a higher saturation and it's going to look more like that GoPro color mode that GoPro is known for. You also have the 3rd option up here at the very top, which is still flat. So if you want to do a lot of color correction later on and choose how you saturate certain colors, you'll want to shoot in flat. At this point, I will probably be using natural most of the time because it looks so good. GoPro did a great job with that natural mode, and that's been my favorite one so far. But if I was in a setting where I wanted to do a lot of color correction later on, I have shot it in flat and added the color back. But natural does such a good job, I anticipate I'm not going to be doing much color correcting when editing. For raw audio, I'm going to keep that off. If I really want good audio from this camera, I'm going to be using an external microphone, which I will connect via the USB-C to 3.5mm jack. The GoPro Hero 10 does have good audio, but I don't find it to be any better than the Hero 9 Black. That's not to say it's bad, but if you want that really good, rich audio quality, you're gonna wanna use an external mic. So for the raw audio, I have that off because I do not want any of the raw audio tracks. And for now, I have the wind mode set to auto. You have a couple different options here. You can have wind reduction on, or you can have wind reduction off. I have it set to auto so that the camera will automatically detect what type of setting I'm in. I don't like to keep it set to wind reduction on because sometimes it'll detect some sound as if it's wind, for instance, the ocean or something else, and I don't necessarily want it to minimize that sound. Sometimes I'm gonna want the sound of the ocean in there. So I keep that set to auto, but I don't want wind reduction off, because if I'm on a hike where there's a lot of wind and I'm talking to the camera and I don't have my external mic, I want audio that's at least usable later on. If wind reduction is turned off, you will often get audio that's pretty much unusable. I tested that out on here just to confirm, and yeah, the audio is definitely unusable on a windy day. So I recommend keeping that to auto if you're going to be using the audio from the camera. The media mod mode, of course, is grayed out. That's going to only be applicable if you have mods connected. And right now, the mods are not supported on here until GoPro releases that November firmware update. So if you're watching this video after November of 2021, chances are all of the mods should be supported by then, if GoPro does indeed release that with their firmware update. And the final category here is the shortcuts. I just leave those as defaults, and I do not change any of those. Let's talk about our next mode. We're gonna go back up here and click the back arrow. Next mode is gonna be cinematic. Cinematic mode is largely going to be the same as the standard mode. The main difference is I'm going to have a couple different settings here. So first of all, for the resolution and frame rate, I am going to have the 5.3K again, because I want to shoot the maximum quality this camera is capable of. And then for the frame rate, I'm going to have 30. The reason I'm going to shoot in 30 is so that I can reduce that speed slightly to the 24. When I interpret that 30 frames per second as 24, it's going to make the speed about 20% slower. So it's not going to be super noticeable that it is slower, but I like that added touch. I always interpret as 24 frames per second unless I have a good reason for having that higher frame rate. But almost all of my videos you see on the GoPro are in 24 frames per second, regardless of what I shot the footage in. So for the cinematic mode, this is gonna be when I want that slightly slower motion for that dreamy effect in footage. It's not going to necessarily be picked up by the human eye, but the brain is going to know. And there's gonna be something a little more appealing about that. For the lens, I'm going to generally use linear plus horizon leveling. But if I'm shooting landscapes for some B-roll, I will use the wide angle lens on there. However, if I have any type of human subject in there, if the subject is not going to be near the center of the frame at all times, I'm not going to use wide, because it will distort to the subject. It will have that fisheye effect, and it will generally not look good. So linear plus horizon leveling is my default for that. For hyper smooth, I'm gonna have that set to high. For scheduled capture, duration, and hindsight, I'm going to leave all of those at their defaults. Timer and zoom, I'm also gonna leave those alone. Under Pro Tune, I'm gonna have a bit rate of high. For the shutter, I'm gonna have that auto, but I will mention that whenever I use ND filters, it is going to be in this mode, the cinematic mode, that I use them. And the reason is those ND filters with that double frame rate are going to provide the proper type of motion blur. This would be the type of blur that you see in movies. For most movies you watch, the finished product is in 24 frames per second. But for this, if I have my ND filters on the camera, the shutter speed is going to be 1/60 since I'm shooting in the 30 frames per second frame rate. For the EV comp, I want to have that at the -0.5 again. For the white balance, I'm going to keep that at 5500K as a general rule, unless I'm shooting around sunset or sunrise, in which case I may have it set around 6500K. For the ISO min, I'm gonna keep it at 100. For the ISO max, I'm gonna keep it at 800. For the sharpness, I'm gonna keep that at medium. The color, I'm gonna keep it at natural. And for the raw audio, I'm gonna keep that off. For the wind, I'm gonna keep that auto. And the media mod, of course, does not apply right now because I do not have any connected. And then all of the shortcuts, I'm gonna leave at defaults because those work great and I don't need to change those up. Let's go on to our next mode here. The next mode is gonna be activity. Activity mode is going to be anytime I want to shoot something and then I want to have that really buttery smooth slow motion later on. One of the new features on the GoPro is the 4K 120 frames per second, which is spectacular. You can get some really good slow motion from this. I've been super impressed with the quality of slow motion. First of all, for this mode, we're gonna set it to 4K, 120 frames per second. For the lens, I'm gonna do linear plus horizon leveling. However, when you click on lens here, since we're in 4K, you will see Super View available as an option. Super View could be good for this if you're doing something where you want that super wide angle lens. So there may be some type of motion. If you're riding a bike, if you're doing downhill skiing, something really intense like that, and you want that super wide view, it is really nice to do that in 4K 120. You're gonna have a broad field that you can slow down. And if there's a lot going on in that frame, that could look pretty cool. Let's say you're skiing down a hill with 5 of your buddies and they're all on each side of you. Imagine shooting that in 4K 120 and then slowing it down 5 times. So it would be 20% of the normal speed if you interpret it as 24 frames per second. That's gonna be some killer footage right there. So that would be a good use case for Super View. Otherwise, I recommend keeping this at linear plus horizon leveling in most other use cases. For hyper smooth, we're gonna have that set to high. For scheduled capture, duration, and hindsight, I'm gonna keep those at their defaults of off, no limit, and off. For timer, I'm gonna keep that off. And zoom, I'm gonna keep that at 1. For Pro Tune, we're gonna have bitrate set to high, always. Shutter, I'm gonna keep that at auto. If you are using an ND filter in this mode, you're gonna wanna set the shutter speed to 1/240th. For the EV comp, I'm gonna have that at the negative 0.5 as always. For the white balance, I'm gonna keep that at 5500K, unless I'm shooting early in the morning or in the evening, in which case I'll put it to 6500K. For the ISO min, I'm gonna keep that at 100, ISO max at 800. The sharpness, I'm gonna keep that at medium. The color, I'm gonna keep natural. And the raw audio is gonna be set to off. And the media mod setting, of course, does not apply right now because I don't have any mods connected. And for the shortcuts, I'm gonna leave all of those alone. They all work well for my use case. Let's go down to this final mode here. So I added a 4th mode called Custom. Custom is going to be my mode I use anytime I'm talking to the GoPro. Once that firmware update is available, I will be changing the resolution up here to 5.3K. But as you'll see, right now, there are no other options in the 24 frames per second. All of these other resolutions are grayed out because 4K is the only one that has 24 frames per second available until that November 2021 firmware update. For this mode, I'm going to have the lens set to linear plus horizon leveling. And the main reason for that is when I'm holding that camera and talking to it, I don't want any type of fisheye. The fisheye does not look good with human subjects, especially if I'm not always in the center of the frame. It's gonna look odd. And at the same time, I always want that horizon to be level, just in case the camera tilts a little while I'm talking to it. It's not going to mess up my footage. Hyper smooth, I want that set to high. Scheduled capture is gonna be off. Duration is going to be no limit, hindsight off. Timer will be off, and zoom will be 1x. For Pro Tune settings, I definitely want that bitrate set to high. I want the shutter set to auto. And for this type of thing, I'm generally not gonna ever use ND filters when I'm talking to the camera. So shutter of auto is gonna be consistent on that. I'm gonna always keep it at that. For the EV comp, I want that at negative 0.5. That way, if there's anything behind me while I'm talking to it or in front of me, it's going to show the detail, the highlights, and the shadows properly. For white balance, I'm gonna keep that set to 5500K for now. Again, if it's morning or evening, I will set it to 6500K. For the ISO min, I'm gonna keep it at 100, and the ISO max, I'm gonna keep it at 800. For the sharpness, I'm gonna keep that at medium, and the color, I'm gonna keep that at natural. Generally, when I'm talking to the camera, I'm gonna probably almost always keep that at natural. Natural does a really good job with skin tones. I got to test this out a lot, both in sunny conditions and in cloudy, and natural did a phenomenal job with capturing skin tones properly, so there's not really a reason not to use it. For raw audio, I'm gonna keep that off. If I'm talking to the camera extensively, I'm almost always going to use an external microphone for best results. For the wind, I'm going to keep that at auto. That won't apply with the external mic. But if I am talking to the camera without the external, that auto will apply and that will give best results. Media mod will be grayed out and not applicable. And shortcuts down here, I'm going to leave those alone. Those all work great for me. Well, there you have it. There are my best settings and what I use each configuration for. I hope you found this video to be helpful. If you found this video to be helpful, please hit that like button. If you haven't already subscribed, please hit subscribe. And if you haven't followed me on Instagram, I've recently opened an Instagram account at Great Day for a Hike. Until we talk again, happy GoProing.